Hey everybody, this is Kira Davis from Just Listen to Yourself right here on the FCB Radio Network, and I've got a great problem. I need a new theme song for the show. So I am asking listeners to send in their submissions for new theme songs for Just Listen to Yourself. If you are a musician or a songwriter or just somebody who wants to try their hand at it, go ahead and send us a song that you think could be used for the theme of Just Listen to Yourself. You could have the chance to win $150, but better than that, your song could get an official release on the Orchard and Sony Records. That's right. The Orchard and Sony Records will release your song as an official single, and it'll get played all across the FCB Radio Network to start and maybe beyond. Send your entry to JLTY at protonmail.com. Contest closes May 31st.
This is the FCB Radio Network, home of the best personalities and where real talk lives. Online at fcbradio.com. FCB.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Just Listen to Yourself with Kira Davis. I am your host, Kira Davis, and this is the podcast where we take our talking points and we draw them out to their logical conclusions, because sometimes I think that we aren't always saying what we think we are. So we've got to examine the things that we're talking about and then draw the talking points all the way out to their logical conclusion. Make sure that what you're saying with your mouth is what is intended with your heart. Clarity will bring us peace. And right now we're very chaotic. Today I want to talk about some other type of chaos that is brewing in the realm of thought and education, and that's critical race theory. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, I have been struggling with how to structure this podcast. Typically, when I'm preparing for a podcast, I would go look at stats, I would go look at numbers. I don't always read those things to you, but they do inform how I structure an argument. And there's just nothing to hang on to here in critical race theory. It is very vague. The goalposts move. Some people lie about what it is. And so finding information, even looking up, like I was even looking up the definition so I could read you something. Even the definitions feel like they don't encompass everything about what critical race theory is as it stands today in 2021 America. So it's strange. It's just a strange topic to get into, but my listeners have been screaming for me to address this. And luckily this week, our mini-sode is going to include an interview with Pastor Daryl B. Harrison, who is the co-host of Just Thinking podcast, and he is a fellow at a theological seminary here in California, and writes a black pastor, and writes a lot about critical race theory as it relates to grace and religion. And I would say this is kind of his area. So we're going to talk to him. Hopefully he'll bring us some more clarity on that as well. But today I am going to try to address the issue myself, and I'm going to do my best. Please hang tight. Please hang with me and just extend some grace. I'm having a lot of trouble thinking through this, to be honest. I really am, because, and I'll just give away my position at the top, not that it should surprise anybody, but to me, critical race theory is mostly nonsensical. And I'm a logical person. It's really taking me a lot of logical leaps to wrap my brain around even making an argument for or against it, which I do believe is actually part of the strategy with schools of thought like this. You keep the goalposts moving. You keep people always never really having anything to grab onto. It creates chaos. Chaos creates confusion. Confusion creates fear. And then you latch on to whatever morsels of justice or information are there. And so I want to create clarity for you. I want to create peace. Maybe when I'm done with this, you'll decide that you are all for critical race theory, and that's that. Maybe, because maybe I've made it more clear to you and you decide you're on board. I don't know. My position is that it's a bad idea. So I don't even really have the intellectual muster to argue this from both sides, if I'm being totally honest. I like for this podcast to be open-minded and for people of all political persuasions to feel comfortable listening to me parse out these ideas. I want you to. I don't want you to think that just because I'm conservative that I loathe your point of view, or that I'm trying to speak poorly of your thought process or your point of view. I'm not, even though I know that in this day and age, and I think critical race theory is a part of this, to be honest, in this day and age, dissent from your opinion can feel like or be received as offense. So I hope if you're a new liberal listener to the show that you'll keep on listening and you'll keep an open mind. And even if some things make you cringe or make you angry, instead of turning off the program, I would entreat you to write to me and contact me and tell me why I'm wrong. JLTY@protonmail.com. JLTY@protonmail.com. Maybe you'll educate me. That is a possibility as well. It has happened before on this show, people. I have had very educational responses from people who have made me think differently, or at least consider a different path of thinking on various subjects. So it can happen. So how do we get into this? I think we should start with a definition. I was looking up several different definitions this past week, and I decided that the best one, because I hate Wikipedia, it can be changed. It's not, I don't think Wikipedia sometimes for like general stuff is decent, but if you really want to get a grip on something, I wouldn't trust Wikipedia. It's, it's user managed, so users can go in and change anything. So I went with the definition from the Britannica.com. Remember Britannica encyclopedias? Britannica, like everyone else, is online now. So here is their definition of CRT, critical race theory. It's an intellectual movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. Critical race theorists hold that the law and legal institutions in the United States are inherently racist insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially. Critical race theory was officially organized in 1989 at the first annual workshop of critical race theory, though its intellectual origins go back much further to the 60s and 70s, and its immediate precursor was critical legal studies. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to tell you more about critical legal studies as I move forward in this argument about why I think CRT is wrong. But right from the top of this definition, even the definition encompasses the vagueness of this theory. It's a loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is, and isn't that interesting that the definition is that race is socially constructed, that it's not real? This is something I hear conservatives say all the time. I found that, I don't know that I have a moral comment on that. I just find that very interesting that those two definitions, that definition aligns among the two groups, like left and right. White conservatives say it all the time. I never say it. I do think that color matters. It doesn't matter a lot. And it certainly shouldn't be central to who you are as an American or human being. But, I say it all the time that for Black people, color is culture. And so it would behoove a lot of white people just to remember that. When you're talking about our culture or you're talking about our race, you're talking about our culture. So when you want to dismiss our race, you're dismissing our culture. It's just the way it is right now. And that's just my personal belief. But a lot of white people I know are sincerely, and some Black people too, sincerely believe that race is a societal construct. There's one race, the human race, and everything else is just what we do to each other, how we label each other. I just thought that was a really interesting point of connect between those very opposed ideologies. Fascinating. I think if we look around and we look at what's happened in the last year, even the last 4 years, we we might be tempted to say, well, critical race theory kind of arose out of this need to focus on combating racism. America's never been more racist. The Trump era was racist. Trump was racist. The wall is racist. We've got immigration. We've got police violence. We've got Black Lives Matter. So critical race theory arose out of the need to fundamentally change the system for the better for people of color. That's easy to say if you look at what's happened over the last year, but that's not where critical race theory comes from, as we saw in that definition, right? It was developed in 1989 all the way back then, but it wasn't actually. That was just an iteration of another theory. So it's not new, and it's not a response to what some of us might think the last 5 years in this country have been like. By the way, I agree with Kamala Harris and Tim Scott that America is not a racist country, that there are racists in it, but what do I always say, folks? A-holes are everywhere. I know this because I grew up in Canada, where y'all keep telling me is utopia. And every election cycle, when the guy you don't like wins, y'all tell me, oh, I'm moving to Canada where it's perfect up there. Canada is not perfect. There are a-holes in Canada too, people. Believe me. And they run the government just like they do here. But we are being told that because America is so bad, that this theory has risen up, and we needed to kind of change. We've been using the idea of police brutality as a way to trigger change in our systems. But here's number one problem I have with critical race theory. Might as well just be blunt. And I'm sorry if you don't like these buzzwords. There's going to be a lot of buzzwords in here, right? Buzzwords that are going to trigger you and make you feel like, oh, right-wing nut job. I need you to agree to go on this journey with me. And again, if at the end you still think I am absolutely off my rocker, please don't just turn it off. Please write to me and tell me why. Tell me why I'm wrong so that I can learn and that I can respond as well. So number one problem I have with critical race theory, it is not what we think it is. It is not what we are told it is. Critical race theory, as I read this definition to you, and let's go back to Britannica. Now, I have cross-referenced this with many other definitions. Okay, so Britannica was the best one. It kind of included everything. So I think you're getting the best definition that most people agree on here. The precursor to critical race theory was critical legal studies. It dedicated itself to examining how the law and legal institutions serve the interests of the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the poor and the marginalized. This is Britannica's words right here. I'm reading verbatim. Ready? Critical legal studies, an offshoot of Marxist-oriented critical theory, may also be viewed as a radicalization of early 20th century legal realism, a school of legal philosophy according to which judicial decision-making, especially at the appellate level, is influenced as much by non-legal, that means political or ideological factors, as by precedent and principles of legal reasoning. Marxism, right there. It says that the law, that we should not be obeying the letter of the law, that the letter of the law is not what matters, that it is how people feel about the law. It's hate crime legislation. This is the birth of hate crime legislation, which takes the letter of the law, which is already which already has made murder illegal. Takes that letter of the law and says, well, that's not enough. We want to add an emotional component to it. So if this person is gay, or if this victim is black, then we feel like the person who murdered the victim probably did it because they harbor ill will towards that race or towards that person's sexuality or whatever. So we're going to add an emotional sentence onto this letter of the law sentence. That's a hate crime. You're basically prosecuting thought. You're basically deciding that I'm sure that what was in this person's head is there's a black guy. I want to kill a black guy because I hate all black people. You're really legislating thought there. But that is what critical legal studies is, right? Inviting that idea of creating an emotional component to a legal process, which is very dangerous. It's very dangerous. I think lawyers would probably tell you that that is what they struggle with the most, is, especially defense lawyers, is like keeping to the letter of the law, keeping the emotion out of the process so that people can be objective about the prosecution of crime. So I've proven here that critical race theory is rooted in Marxism. In fact, I don't know that there's that many proponents of CRT who would deny that Marxism is a big part of this. There may be some, like Black Lives Matter is a Marxist organization, and they are based in critical race theory. And they have, the Marxists, they had the Marxist tenets on their website. One of the tenets is to destroy the nuclear family. I mean, literally said, destroy the nuclear family, dismantle the nuclear family. That's what it said. That's a Marxist principle, that the family is an impediment to true equality, to true equity. The family is an impediment to that. Anyways, they got so much kickback because black people love families, and we don't want our families to be destroyed. In fact, we recognize in a lot of our communities that the family has been devastated particularly by government intervention, and we would like our families back. We're fighting to get our families back. So BLM had to sneakily erase that, right? This is another reason why I'm so suspicious of CRT, because people are always having to hide some of the more distasteful parts of it. If you are comfortable with this theory, then own it. It's my suspicion a lot of people don't know what the theory is. They have a sign in their yard and they think it's related to Black Lives Matter, and they love black people and they want justice and equality. And so they think that critical race theory is sort of balancing the scales, but it is not. I'm going to prove it to you. Critical race theory inevitably tips the scales for one side or the other. In any case, it is bad for all of us. It does nothing to solve any problems, but simply creates more problems. And in fact, it is such a regressive theology, and I call it a theology, and I think probably Daryl Harrison is going to refer to it. We're going to talk about why it is a theology. It's not just an academic pursuit, but people have made it a religion. But it's such a regressive theology that actually what it does, ironically, is it ends up putting us, black people, back into the original problems that we had. Being segregated, being looked at as other, being discriminated against. Let's just go into this. Critical race theory is based in Marxism. That is not a buzzword. That is not a lie. That is not a right-wing conspiracy. I just read to you the definition from Britannica.com, and you can go look that up yourself. So that is not propaganda. That is the truth. If you're involved in critical race theory and you're involved with a group, you need to ask your group about the roots of critical race theory. If they tell you that critical race theory once upon a time was based in Marxism, but now we've rejected that, then I want you to remind them that once upon a time, America was a slave-owning country, and now we've rejected that. Right? How come it's okay for them to eject their roots in the pursuit of some what they consider something better, but it's not okay for the rest of us to eject our shameful past and our shameful roots to say, hey, we're not that anymore. We've totally changed. Marxism is about, I don't want to spend too much time on Marxism. I feel like if you don't know what it is, please look it up. This is the other thing. There's so much here. It's really difficult to address it like as a whole. You have to take it in pieces, which when you cut it up into pieces makes it look a little less threatening. But it is. I don't believe this is good for any of us. Not you on the left, not me on the right, definitely not black people. I promise you. I sincerely believe this with my whole heart. But Marxism is a system of thought that claims that there is a huge imbalance between capitalists and workers, and you have to seize the means of production in order to even the playing field, create equity. And equity is different from equality. How is equity different from equality? I'll probably be asking Daryl about this a little bit more also. Equity is redistribution. Equity is you having a grown-up, a 10-year-old, and a toddler and giving them all a quarter of a cup of juice, because the toddler really can't consume more than that, and it's not fair that everybody else gets more than that. So equity is giving everybody a quarter of a cup of juice. Equality says everybody gets juice, but if you're older, you get more juice because you do more work. You've lived longer. You need more sustenance. And if you're 10, you get more juice than the toddler, because for the same reasons. But when that toddler gets to be 10, that toddler will have the same amount of juice as well. Equity versus equality. And you may feel that that is fine. You may feel that it is fine to deny the adult what they've earned by growing into that body and that frame and the needs that they have. You may feel that, okay, that is the right thing to do, to deny the adult the fruits of their biology, let's say, just simply by growing. And that's fine if you want to say that. But you need to know that's Marxism. And if you're a Marxist, then own that and defend that. Let's talk to each other honestly about who we are and what we believe. That's what this show is about. Don't be afraid of what you believe. And if you think that other people can't handle it, if you feel like, well, if I say this, then already the argument's lost, no one's going to listen to me, then you don't know how to defend your idea. Then you haven't thought about how to defend your position. If you can't defend it, perhaps it's indefensible. And again, we just read the definition about the precursor to CRT, which is rooted in Marxism. And Marxism teaches, in my opinion, actually inequity. And it's the idea of equity that the CRT scholars or CRT pushers or whatever you want to call them use to discuss the idea of racism, systemic racism, and how it can be solved. And just like the Marxist believes that equity is redistribution, right? Making sure everybody has the exact same thing at the exact same time. Anti-racism, as they call it, is a redistribution of equality. That's all it is. It's another form of redistribution. It is activists looking at white Americans and saying, you have been too privileged for too long. You have risen on the backs of oppression and slavery and many, many evil things. And so now we need to take that privilege and redistribute it because we need equity. And equity, the idea of equity, equality, just to return to that analogy of the toddler, the 10-year-old, and the adult. Equality is, everybody's going to get the same chance to grow and to grow up. That toddler's going to be 10 and then they're going to be 50. Everybody gets that chance. There's growth in equality, right? There's room for growth. Equity, there's no room for growth. In order to be equitable, you got to cut that adult off at the knees so they're as short as the toddler. And then you can be like, see, now they only get a quarter cup of juice because that's all they need. They don't have as much body. There's no growth in equity. Equity is a diminutive process. Is that the right word? It's a regressive process. But that is what Marxism pushes, and that is what CRT is. That is why CRT is an outgrowth of Marxism, because it says we're not going to grow people. We're not going to give people the potential to grow. What we need to do is to pull back. What we need to do is to cut more people off at the knees and then redistribute the privilege that they had to other people. It means we've got to take something away and give it to somebody else instead of how do we grow this for everybody? How do we make sure that the people at the bottom of the ladder have the opportunity to grow inequality, to get to the stage where you get to have the same things that everybody else at that stage gets to have, because that's what you get when you work your way to that position. So instead, we're not offering equality. We're not offering an apparatus to achieve more equality. I'm not saying that there's no inequality. What I'm saying is that equity is not the answer to less inequality.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
Equity creates more inequality. It's injustice. Let that man keep his legs. You don't take a man's legs away from him because someone else is shorter. Give the shorter person the tools they need to reach the same height as the taller person. A ladder, calcium to grow taller, the ability to handle situations at their own level, just as effectively as the tall person. There's all kinds of ways that don't include cutting off that tall person at the knees. Equity is not equality, and equity is not achievable without regression. And we don't want to regress, do we? We want to grow. We should always be growing. It's literally the nature of the universe, is to be growing. Anything that is regressive should worry you. How is CRT regressive? Okay. So I'm going to move. You can see I'm struggling to talk about this because there's so much. I'm just trying to fit it all in. But thankfully, Daryl will be here with us, and we can draw this out a little more. But let me do this. I'm going to read some talking points on CRT, and then I'll respond to the talking points. How about that? Let's do it that way. All right. Critical race theory teaches compassion. That is a talking point. And that is why we've got to get it into the schools, because we've got to help the kids learn how to be compassionate towards one another. I completely disagree. I think CRT teaches envy and otherization. And all you have to do is look up any CRT lesson that you've seen in a school, any kind of demonstration that a teacher has done in their classroom. We write about it all the time at my website. You can see it on the news all the time, people complaining, parents getting upset that some of these exercises involve white kids telling kids of color why it's bad to be white, or how they have oppressed them, or how they're the oppressed. It's framed as the white kids in the class are the problem. Now, again, I would never allow that from someone to do that to my black kid, to my black son, my black daughter. I would never allow that in a classroom. I would lose my freaking mind if I found out that a teacher was assigning my daughter lessons that require her to take the position of being less than everybody else, of being their enemy simply by how she looks. And that now it's her responsibility to correct all this for her entire race. She's 13. That is not a lesson that you put on a 13-year-old's shoulders, or a 5-year-old's, or a 9-year-old's. School is for reading and writing. And if you can't teach that, you're doing something wrong. Those kind of lessons have no place in the classroom. So I don't think it teaches compassion. I think it teaches kids to look at each other as enemies, not as allies. Because here's the other thing about critical race theory. There's no way out. It is a catch-22. If you reject it, you're being fragile. That's white fragility, right? If you stay silent, you're being complicit. That's what the term anti-racism is all about. And I wholeheartedly reject that term. And that is a Marxist policy or strategy, I guess is a better word. That it's actually part of of the handbook, if you will, anti whatever. Because when you set yourself up as anti, then if the person, it's assertive. So if the person you're talking to is not anti, it makes them automatically pro. So if you're not anti-abortion, then you must be pro-abortion. If you're not anti-ice cream, then you must be pro-ice cream. If you are not anti-racist, then obviously you are for racism. You're either for it or against it. And everything else is you being complicit or you being fragile or you being an oppressor. The only option is to remember Chris Pratt got into trouble, I think on one of the set of the Guardians of the Galaxies or whatever. Black Lives Matter was going on and everyone in the cast tweeted out something or did something on their Instagram except him. And he was lambasted for not saying anything. He didn't say anything for it, against it, nothing. He posted a picture of his kid or something and people blasted him. And they were like, we've got to cancel Chris Pratt. He's canceled. Why is he canceled? Is he canceled because he called someone the N-word? Is he canceled because he kicked a little kid in the teeth when he was walking down the street? No, he got canceled for not saying anything. He got canceled for just being quiet and minding his own business. That's why the term anti-racism is dangerous. And the sentiment behind it is especially dangerous because it sets people up to have to take a vocal position on issues that they might prefer to feel privately about. And it's the idea that that's the other thing about Marxism. Nothing is private, right? Everything belongs to the public. Everything is public. Everything is centralized, even your opinion. Your opinion is not even allowed to be your own. You are not even allowed to hold that opinion to yourself. You're anti or pro. You're never quiet. What happens when we eliminate the quiet spaces in our society? Chaos. So I don't think it teaches compassion. It teaches awareness about white privilege. That's another talking point. It teaches awareness. If I'm going to say anything nice about this, it'll be here. Because I'm going to be honest with you people, I don't think we'd be having some of these conversations that we're having about the difference between being black in America and being white in America if it weren't for these bellyachers in the CRT, the CRT theory crowd. And Black Lives Matter. I don't like the way they've gone about things. I don't like how obviously, go back and listen to my Black Lives Matter episode. I don't have time to rehash everything. Y'all know how I feel about it, right? But I do believe the discussion should be had. And as somebody who has lived as a black woman, but who is half white and has lived in both cultures, if you will. I mean, I know culture is a very general term, but if you will, I can tell you from personal experience that there is a difference between how black people live their lives and how white people live their lives in America, and that there is a different worldview, and that there are experiences that we have as black Americans that seem benign to many white people, but are very emotional for us and create struggle for us. Those things are real. And in the past, sometimes we talk about them and it's like, hey, America is America. You know, just stop whining and put your boots on and get to work. There's definitely a conversation to be had in here about what CRT would refer to as privilege, or about the idea of being a minority in a majority society and how that changes your worldview and how that changes things for you. I think that's the better way to look at it, by the way, the inequities, or to look at white privilege. That's actually, because there is kind of a thing, and I think we've all landed on this term privilege, and fine, I'll use it. But I think really what it is, it's majority versus minority. And you'll find that in any society. It is a struggle to be a minority in a majority society. Not necessarily because that society is racist, but because when everyone around you looks like you don't really consider what's going on downstream with the people who don't look like you. You don't have to, right? Black people have to consider what white life is like because we live in that world every day. We must interact with it in order to survive in this country, but it's not the opposite. White people don't have to do that they don't have to interact with us or blend into our culture in order to be successful or whatever. Is that white versus black, or is that majority versus minority? So I do agree that it's even in the aspect that it's created a lot of rage and a lot of pushback. At least it's been driving us to discuss this and to work out our beliefs and our talking points on these issues, and that much I appreciate. But the awareness that CRT teaches isn't about equality, isn't about, hey, at least like thinking about what it's like to be the member of the majority in a society which contains these multiple minorities, and what that means for you and your life and how people perceive you, whatever. Instead of that, the awareness is white people, you suck. White people, are even the nice ones, are a problem because they are a part of the system, and we have to cut their legs off so that they can be at the same height as a minority culture, because it isn't fair that they've had all this time ahead of us to grow, right? And that is an argument that's a legitimate argument, by the way, when it comes to wealth building in this country, and when it comes to a thriving culture. A legitimate argument is that many all white families, whether you're poor or not, poor, rich, whatever, have had a historical head start on the rest of us when it comes to building wealth generation to generation, or building power, or building understanding, or building influence, right? Equity says we have to cut you white people off at the knees. We have to remind you that you're the problem in this country. And so we got to bring you down to the level that we think you've kept us at all this time. We've got to bring you down to that level. That's equity, right? It's not about raising other people up, is it? It never is. It's about bringing people down to where you think they're supposed to be. Equality says, okay, white Americans have had a 200-year head start. If we give Black Americans the same access to their human rights and all of the machinations of this economy and this country and capitalism, in 200 years we'll be there too. Equality says we're taking the reins off of whatever entrenched systems of discrimination have existed. We're taking the reins off so that you can grow, so that opportunity is equal, so that you can go from that toddler to the adult without us having to cut the knees off the adult to make you the same. If we let you grow in a healthy manner, you're going to grow into that adult too. That's what equality would say. So I don't think it teaches awareness. I think it teaches shame. Shame has no place in it. And people don't change how they believe because of shame. Most people don't change their beliefs at all. But when they do change their beliefs, it's not because of something you said. It's always because of something you did. If you want to change people's minds about race, and you think, oh, all white people are racist, if you want to change their minds, then all this talk at them is not going to change anybody's mind. Live a life that they respect. Live a life that is gentle and compassionate. It teaches anti-racism. It teaches kids to not be racist or to be against racism. Anti-racism, I would say the definition of that is to be against racism. It doesn't teach you to not be racist. It teaches you to be against racism. But how do you form a physical program that teaches people to be against racism? You're going to have to otherize somebody. You're going to have to otherize somebody to do it. So it creates more segregated categories. In order to teach people anti anything, you have to set up us and them. You have to set up good and bad. You have to set up right side versus wrong side. To be anti anything, that is exactly the delineation. It's one side or the other, and you're being declarative. And so in order to be declarative, you have to separate people into groups. Already you're segregating. Critical race theory is inclusive and teaches inclusivity. And a lot of people will point to the changing curriculum and maybe getting rid of Columbus Day and putting Native American Heritage Day in, or restructuring the curriculum so we read more classic work or modern classic works from people of color instead of the traditional classics like Mark Twain or Shakespeare. And it's inclusive lessons, and it teaches lost history. It teaches history that hasn't really been taught in the schools. First of all, I disagree with this word inclusivity. It has been perverted, and that is another hallmark of CRT, changing goalposts, shifting goalposts. Inclusivity in critical legal studies meant that you were not pigeonholed into one group. That's intersectionality, right? It's the idea you're not just in one group. You can be black and you speak for gay people if you're gay, and you speak for trans people if you're trans also, and you speak for brunettes if you're a brunette, and whatever your groups are. That all people of all groups are welcome. Inclusivity says, hey, this landscape has been exclusive to one group of people for too long. It's time to be inclusive. But inclusivity doesn't exist in CRT because it necessarily bans certain people from the circle. White people. So inclusivity becomes inclusivity except y'all. How is that inclusive? Inclusivity except you who might have a different point of view on this, you who are white. Look at what happened over, and it's still going on in Portland. It's ridiculous. Where are the adults in Portland? Somebody get it together over there. But still, over there, if you watch the Black Lives Matter, people take over their own cities over the summer. One of the things that eventually happened was even the white, quote, allies that were doing a lot of the organizing and a lot of the protesting, they got pushed out by POC, right? Black, Indigenous people of color, by POC. And they got pushed out and said, hey, even though you're on our side, you're not allowed to speak. You are not included in this conversation because you've always had the opportunity to speak. And now it's our turn, and therefore you're not allowed. Again, that's equity. That is cutting the knees off somebody to make them the same height as you instead of striving to be their height. So it's not inclusive. It excludes many people from the conversation. And in fact, it excludes America from the conversation. It excludes the merits of America. Do you think America has any merit at all? I do. Even if you are a Marxist, even if you are a liberal or left winger, don't you think that there are some merits to this nation? And I'm talking about outside of, yes, this nation allows me to stand up and protest. Outside of that, is there anything about your life in this country that is good? Is there anything about the good things that happen in this country that is worth teaching a child in the classroom? See, CRT excludes that. We can talk about how bad America has been and all the bad things that happen within the country, but we cannot talk about the good of America. And it teaches lost history. I'm actually for this. I love the idea. If you go back to my canceling history episode, I talked about what do we do about this situation with the statues, because some of them are icons to racist figures or whatever. But the solution is not to tear down history. Build up beside it. Build up next to it. You got your statue of whoever, I don't know, generally put another like black historical figure who was important in that time, or Native American figure who was important at that time, next to General Lee. And tell both stories, because whether you like it or not, both stories are part of this country. I hate Black History Month. I've come to appreciate it more as I get older, but what I hate about it is that it's got to be a month. It shouldn't even be Black history is American history, and yet we separated. And that was something we did for ourselves. We thought that would be good for us. This is rooted in Marxist theory. It's the idea that we need to be segregated in the realm of ideas from the bad guys. They haven't done enough for us, and so we're going to create this separate thing for us, right? This Black History Month, so that we can be seen more, so that we can force people to see us more. Which on the surface is like, great, that sounds great. And I've gone up and down with Black History Month over my years as an adult. But all it does is creates this safe space. We're going to talk about safe spaces in a minute. It creates this safe zone where, okay, now this is the month we teach Black history in, and then we can forget about it. But Black history is American history. You can't tell the story of America without Black people. Why would you want to? Why do we? It should be just a regular part of every lesson. We shouldn't be having to point everything out as this is part of this is the Black history section of our textbook. There's no point in America which Black people did not contribute in some significant way. None. So that's what bothers me about it. And that I believe that that's what CRT does as well. It basically segregates history. It says, okay, this history we don't like, we don't want anymore. This history is a history you need to learn because we haven't learned enough of it. And I actually agree on that point that there are many stories to be told that have not been included in our textbooks, but we don't learn enough of it. So we need to put this in and kick everything out. So gone are lessons about the Founding Fathers, in our lessons about Native American history. But all you're doing is excluding. Again, it's an exclusion. Again, it's cutting off the other person so they're as short as you instead of figuring out how to grow. We don't want less history in our schools. We want more history in our schools. Also, by the way, how much of this is just the fact that history is always told by the victors? And the cycle of conquering and seeding civilizations in this world, it's not pretty. And it hasn't ever been pretty. And so as part of being a minority part of being a minority in a majority society is like understanding that the majority society gets to set the tone simply by their numbers. Part of history is told by the victors. Why don't we learn more about Native American history? Because the victors smashed Native American supremacy in this nation. Fair? Probably not. But, what is fair when it comes to war and conquering? And it's an ugly business. We are ugly people. We are fallen. This is why we need a creator, a savior. Critical race theory purports to save ourselves, which we cannot do. We will always make a bigger mess of this. And this is the perfect example. Critical race theory creates segregation. It creates segregation. It is regressive. The idea of safe spaces. I was just reading this article. It's from the Washington Free Beacon. Cornell students defend racially segregated rock climbing course. Participants say segregation is necessary to create safe spaces. Cornell first offered bi-POC rock climbing in the spring of 2021 exclusively to people who identify as Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, or other people of color. The school removed the racial enrollment requirement in response to the school eventually removed the racial enrollment requirement in response to a campus reform inquiry. Students enrolled in the course objected to the move, telling the Cornell Daily Sun that segregating the class is a small step towards racial equality. At the end of the day, there's an issue of inaccessibility for minorities in this white-centric sport, and bi-POC rock climbing is a small step towards desegregating that community. Somebody said that. That's what Matthew Gavieta, a junior and bi-POC rock climbing class instructor, said. Somebody said those words out loud. You wonder why we need this show? We need this show because we need to be encouraging each other to actually think about what he said. If there was a case in this episode for the title of this show, it is here. Just listen to yourself, Matthew. It makes no sense. Yeah, we're going to create equality through segregation. We're going to create integration through segregation. It makes no sense. It is absolutely regressive. Harriet Tubman is turning over in her grave. Martin Luther King turning over in his grave. Even Malcolm X. Because even Malcolm X understood that if you're going to segregate, then just segregate. Don't try to call it anything other than what it is. We got a different vertical than y'all, and that's what we're going with. At least Malcolm X had the balls to say he didn't want anything to do with white people. These people are lying to themselves, and they're lying to you. They're telling you that they're in seek of greater equality. No, they're not. They're in seek of equity, and equity means cutting off the knees of those white rock climbers because for some reason they're the problem at the rock climbing gym. If you want to go rock climbing, go in there and climb the wall. Which is the idea that you need to segregate. And imagine this story turned around. Let's what if this. Let's what about this. What if this story reads Cornell University under fire for white students asking for a segregated whites-only space for rock climbing? That's racist. See, equity says it's okay for the Black people, the bi-POC people, to be racist because we're just doing what's been done to us for all this time. And that is equity, right? Bringing someone else down. Do you see that they have no interest? Do you see, even in that little statement I read to you, they have no interest in becoming the majority in the sport, right? They haven't said anything about how do we grow the BIPOC climbing community? How do we become the majority of faces in this gym? How do we spread the love of climbing among the BIPOC community so that we can get to the level where we're the influencers in the rock climbing community? There's no mention of that. It's all about how can we constrain, restrain, and regress in order to achieve equity, what they call equality. This is so backwards. You cannot right a wrong with a wrong. And you cannot segregate yourself into integration. You cannot segregate yourself into equality. Segregation is the very definition of inequality. It makes no sense. It's absolutely insane. It's bizarre. So it doesn't teach equality. It teaches thought. CRT, critical race theory, it sounds really smart. It's a way of thinking. It's a academic process, and it did start as an academic process, right? Critical legal studies. It did start as an academic process. But the idea that CRT creates thought, no, CRT dismisses thought. CRT discourages thought. CRT downright bans thought. I gave you the example of Chris Pratt, who people try to cancel him because he said nothing. Not because he said one thing or the other, because he said nothing. And because he said nothing, that meant he had thoughts of his own. And that's not good. How many critical race theory proponents have you heard in the media who have said, we need to ban XYZ? We need to ban this. Anybody who believes that, I don't know, that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, anybody who believes that, they should be banned off the internet. I'm not having those conversations. I retweeted a post from a teacher recently who said, I'm all for open discussion in my classroom and I'm open-minded, but anybody who has anything detrimental to say about critical race theory cannot be in this classroom. We're not going to do critical. He literally said, we're not going to engage in critical thinking. That's what this guy said. We're not going to engage in critical thinking. Bigotry disguised as critical thinking is not going to pass in this classroom. So I'm open-minded, but if you have this point of view, then I will not entertain the discussion and I will kick you out of my classroom. It discourages thought. It discourages dissent. It discourages discussion. It discourages analyzing anything. That's how it's set up, right? That's why they use the term anti-racism. You're anti or you're pro. There's nothing else. There's no just being a person who values other people and who doesn't need to put a label on the love that they have for the human race. You know, there's none of that. You're either pro or against, and therefore there is no middle ground. There is no discussion to be had because the two sides have already been decided. And once somebody else has decided things for you, you no longer have any autonomy or any free ability to think freely. So critical race theory demands that people shut down their reasoning process. Look at what happened with these kids. They actually said out loud, in order to get more equality, we need to segregate ourselves. There have been campuses, even my son's college, he was not college this year. He took it from home for obvious reasons, but they sent out a notice about their commencement services this year, and they were having segregated services. Here's the one for BIPOC folks. You know, imagine, again, here's a whites-only graduation ceremony, which is basically what they were creating, right? What do the white folks do when the BIPOC folks go off to segregate themselves for their own celebrations? Well, then you create a whites-only celebration. These people are creating their own segregation and not even thinking it through because they're not allowed to think it through. Because even the idea of discussing it, drawing out those things to their logical conclusions, even that is offensive. So CRT necessarily demands that you shut down your reasoning process and simply accept the principles. It's why Black Lives Matter took the nuclear family thing off their website. Because when people think about it, they don't like that. People love their families almost everywhere on earth. You know, there's nobody who would rather the government raise their kids than themselves. So they had to take it off because the notion spurred thought. And you don't want people to be thinking too deeply about the logical conclusions of the things you're talking about.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
The middle class has to be erased in the idea of critical race theory, and that is a Marxist thing as well. And you know the Black Lives Matter leader Patrice Cooliers, I think is her name. She got into trouble for buying like a $1.5 million house here in California with her BLM money, and that's because BLM, that's even on their website, finds the middle class to be patriarchal, and capitalism and property ownership to be a tool of white supremacy. Land ownership is a big thing in BLM and in Marxism. Is the idea that if landowners are a problem, they're the man, and so if you want true equity, then you've got to start taking land away from people and giving it to others. But you certainly don't go buy a $1 million house. You know, I don't think Patrice has any plans to chop up that house and give it to other people who don't have $1 million houses, right? That's why she got in trouble. You're not supposed to be a landowner. You're not supposed to have that kind of investment. The middle class has been the stabilizing force in any great and free nation. The middle class represents equality. It represents upward mobility. That's why you have to erase the middle class in this discussion. We're only ever allowed to talk about rich people who are always horrible or poor people who are always noble. And we're never able to talk about this step in between, which is very American, which has propelled us to be a superpower in this nation, in this world, excuse me. We're never allowed to talk about what it means to be middle class and how that is a very apparatus of equality in this nation. The middle class represents growth. And CRT says growth is bad. We don't want people to grow. We need to cut people down to the same level. What do you do with the middle class then? Who aren't rich, but they're not poor. You got to erase us. And that's what CRT is trying to do. So that's why when you see these helpless parents in these school board meetings and they're crying, and I'm sorry, some of them happen to be white. I'm sorry. But white people get to have opinions too, folks. And those opinions aren't going to always line up with yours. And as I just pointed out, whether you agree with them or not, I've made some logical arguments for why critical race theory is actually detrimental. And it's regressive. And as such, we should not be teaching it to our children in our public school system. They can make those arguments too. But that is why when those people stand up, you see a litany of articles on The Root and Huffington Post and CNN or whoever, just degrading these people, just shouting them down and calling them idiots and calling them bigots and racists because they don't agree with this curriculum and they don't want it in their schools. That's an erasure, folks. That's erasing somebody's feelings, erasing someone's point of view. That's equity. Because I can hear some of y'all already going up there, well, you know what? Black folks' point of view has been erased for years. Native Americans' point of view has been erased for years. Yeah, I get it. You're talking about equity. I'm talking about equality. And they're two different things, and equality is the goal, and equity is hell. And we can't survive with it. So Well, Kira, how do we teach about racism? If we don't include CRT in schools, how do we teach our kids about racism? Why does the school need to teach about racism? The school can teach about the history. School can teach about back in the day when we did this and we did that, and that was wrong. Why is it up to the school to teach about racism? Why should the school teach your kid to be an anti-racist? Why can't that be left up to the parents? No, I'm going to ask you again. Why does the public school system have to be put in charge of teaching this? Why can't acceptance and tolerance be taught at home? Why can't we leave that to parents to teach at home? Now I'm going to ask you again. Why does a public school have to teach anti-racism? Why can't that be left to parents to do at home? I ask the question over and over again because I can hear the answers, and I typically find I can hear them in my head, by the way. They're not really in this room. I'm not that crazy. But I find that the first two times you ask that question, people will say, well, this is an educational process and you go to school to be educated. But when you keep digging in, when you keep asking, yeah, but why can't you just leave? If this is such a controversial thing, why not just leave this to the parents then? And you concentrate on reading and writing. And the answer is, and you know what the answer is, and this is why we need to be honest about what we believe so we can all discuss it freely. The answer is you don't think some parents are going to make the right choices for their kids. You don't think the parents know how to raise their own kids. And that's a message that will not resonate in any school district. So you can't say it out loud. It's got to be something else. Well, we need to. No, what you're saying is, hey, parents aren't going to do the right things for their kids. And guess what? Sometimes parents don't do the right things for their kids. That's what freedom is. Freedom is the ability to make bad choices just as you have the ability to make good choices. And sometimes those bad choices mean that you are an a-hole to other people. Or you raise a little a-hole, you know? That's not the school's job to engineer parents, to engineer parenting. And I'm sorry you don't like that, but you know what? Adults deal with that. Adults deal with the reality of the real world. Adults deal with the fact that everybody isn't going to think like you, isn't going to look like you, and isn't going to believe the things that you believe, and that is okay. You are protected by law. Your life and liberty are protected by law in this country. You have the tools to protect yourselves against weirdos and people who would be racist and people who would do these things to you. We're all endowed with those tools and those rights. So let people be who they are. Let them be on the fringes, which is usually where bad ideas go to live if we give them enough space to breathe. Bad ideas don't like fresh air. Fresh air dries them out, and then they end up going to the fringes where they belong. So who's going to teach your kid not to be a racist? You are. Your neighbor is going to teach their kid. It's not up to the teacher in the classroom. The teacher teaches your kid to read and write. So if there's anybody who is having a discussion about CRT in the classroom, that is a question you need to ask and keep asking and keep asking and keep asking. Why can't this be something that parents do for themselves at home? Why can't this be something that parents do for their own kids at home? And make people tell you it's because you don't know what you're doing. Make people tell you that. Make people be honest. And then we can have an honest discussion. And let's have that discussion. Socialist friends, Marxist friends, let's have that discussion. You come to me with your arguments and convince me why the state is a better parent for my child than I am. Lay it out. Persuade me. Don't lie to me about what you believe.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
Last thing I'll say about CRT. Nobody wins. There's no winners, ever. There's only losers. We minorities lose because we lose out on the richness of a culture that embraces, an American culture, that embraces people of all walks of life, of all faiths and ethnicities and races. we miss out on the richness of that experience. And we create a new racism, a new segregation. Look, critical race theory creates segregation. Can you think of a time in the world's history? Can you think of a time in the world's history where a minority population was purposefully segregated from the majority population and thrived? Can you think of one? I can't. Love it or hate it, we need each other. Black people are always on the losing end of social experiments. Always, 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 without exception. Black people are always in this country on the losing end of a social experiment. There is not one instance you can point to in our history in which we haven't been on the losing end of a social experiment. Slavery and Jim Crow and welfare and drug culture and replacing dads with government or engineering the economy so that women have to work more and can't stay home with their kids because they got to go out and earn. Black people are on the losing end of every single social experiment. And we still live in a society that is majority white. It's not majority, it's majority minority right now, meaning there's a lot of different kinds of minority groups in this country. Am I right about that, guys? Someone correct me if I'm wrong. If not, it's close, right? Close to white people being a minority in the respect that minority populations combined are increasing. But white people are still the majority in this country. You're lying to yourself if you think that us segregating ourselves is going to end up well for us. We're just going to end up segregating ourselves from equality. We're going to end up segregating ourselves from the opportunities that we need to get to the places where all those white people we envy are. We'll be the ones to suffer. Communism and socialism have never been good for black people, ever. They certainly won't be in this country, so it's no solution. It will create more problems for us. Forget about white folks. For us, it will create more problems. We will segregate ourselves into suffering. So black people can't win with critical race theory. White people certainly don't win, which is kind of the point. But there's also no end game. When do we know that we won? When do we know this is over? When do we know that we have finally righted all the wrongs and that we have finally reached true equity in this country? Somebody tell me, what's the end game? When do we know we won this race? When do we know we have eliminated racism? We don't, because there's no end game here. It never ends. It's unending hell. It's unending oppression. It's unending inequality and discrimination and bigotry. It doesn't end. And now there are people who have made their entire livelihoods on critical race theory. Are they working to eliminate their own very lucrative jobs? No. It's an industry now. So we're never going to solve it. There's always going to be something that we feel slighted about. Look at these kids in Cornell that they found a way to be offended by a rock wall. You know, the complaints never end if you don't have an end game, a goal to get to. Humans need goals. We need to set goals for ourselves. And there's no end game here. It can just go on in perpetuity. If there is an end game, tell me what it is. And I don't want you to tell me the end game is to eliminate racism, because that's very vague. Give me a solid line in the sand. Well, Kira, when we've reached the point we spent $6 trillion on anti-racism programming, that's how we know we've reached the end. Or when I don't know. I mean, and be honest about it. Be honest about it. Maybe the end for you, we reach the end when we never elect another Republican in this country again. Or we reach the end when there are no people who call themselves conservatives left in this country. Whatever it is, be honest about it. Just be honest about what you believe. And argue from that point and persuade me. Persuade me. All right, I've gone on long enough. apologize for I feel like this podcast was all over the place today, and I really do apologize, but it's really hard to wrap the logical mind around the fallacies or the illogic of this theory. I mean, even just reading that small segment from those kids at Cornell, it boggles the mind. It boggles the brain. It's almost scrambled my brain. And that is the thing. Sometimes people depend on these things being so convoluted that we mistake convoluted for academic. And it's not. These are not logical theories. When you draw them out to their logical conclusion, they do not bode well for any of us, black or white, American or otherwise. That is my sincere opinion. I think it's the right one. But if you disagree, you contact me, JLTY at protonmail.com, JLTY at protonmail.com. Also want to let you know, my father-in-law and I talked about critical race theory over at Davis Nation. And so there's a nice bonus Zoom chat for you to check in on. And he had some really interesting things to say about that, especially when it comes to grace, especially when it comes to the nature of humanity. So you definitely want to go get some wisdom from Pastor Vic. You can join Davis Nation by going to davisnation.locals.com and getting a subscription. It's month to month. If you don't like what you get for your little $5 a month, fine. Don't renew next month, but I hope you will. We have chats. We have a lot. We have a lot going on. So much fun stuff. My song contest, I'm extending it through May 31st. So I've actually gotten some good entries so far. So keep them coming. The song contest, because we're not too pressed to get something new right away. So I want as many entries as possible, and I want to play them for you so that you kind of get an idea. But go ahead. If you're sitting on some music for me and you're like, oh, I missed that deadline, don't worry about it. Send in your submission. You could win $150, but not only that, you could win an official release from The Orchard and Sony Records. Yeah, that's a big deal. So send it to JLTY at protonmail.com, JLTY at protonmail.com. We'll play it on the show, and you'll have a chance to get an official record release. I mean, that's pretty awesome. Today, we're going to end the show with an entry from Rebecca Turner. Rebecca sent this in. She said, I'm not a musician, let alone a rapper, but yet when I wrote this, well, she said I'm not a songwriter, let alone a rapper, but when I wrote this, it sounded like a rap to me. So here you go. And I love it, Rebecca. I absolutely love the idea of letting a piece speak to you and kind of like letting it wash over you and going with that. That's so creative. And my favorite people are the people who aren't afraid to take those chances and to be themselves as well. To just be like, well, you know what? I'm going to try it. And if it works out, it works out. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But this is how I hear it in my head. So kudos to you, Rebecca. Thank you for sending this in. This is Rebecca Turner. If you have a song that you'd like to submit to our theme song contest, of course, go to JLTY at protonmail.com. And, or you can send me even your complaints, your agreement, whatever you want at that address. And stay tuned for the minisodes this week from Daryl Harrison. That's going to be really fun. Join us at davisnation.locals.com. And don't forget, as you go about this week, every now and again, just stop and listen to yourself.
Just listen to yourself and take your time. You're about to engage in exercising the mind. When you draw things out to their logical conclusion, you may find what you're saying is only an illusion. You start by thinking in a critical way. Next thing you know, you may change what you say. Hear others and hear yourself and extend a little grace, and we may be able to reach a common place. Kira Davis is your host, and she wants to persuade, so drop what you're doing and get ready to engage.
The FCB Radio Network. First class broadcasting worldwide.